Welcome everybody for one more Sunday webinar from BOA. The theme for today's webinar is Enigmatic X-Files. As you know, we get a lot of interesting, mysterious cases in our OPD, which we really think how to go about it. And this time we have a potpourri of all subspecialties. So we have experts from each and every field to share with us common mysterious cases which we see in the OPD. The webinars all this while were only pertaining to a particular subspecialty, but this time we thought we would include all the subspecialties. So over to Dr. Preetham sir to introduce all our speakers, and thank you Centis for this support for the BOA webinar.
Thank you, Swapnesh. I welcome all our members, seniors, teachers on this another edition of BOA Talk Plugged In. And our faculty for today are really eminent names. They really don't need an introduction, but I have the pleasant formality of introducing all of them. So we have first, I'm audible, right, Swapnesh? You can hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So we have first Dr. Savri Desai, who's going to, she's a consultant at Hinduja Hospital, and her main area of interest is oculoplasty and ocular oncology. Then we have Dr. Himalini Samant, who is herself a pediatric ophthalmologist and a neuro-ophthalmologist. She's going to present a case pertaining to that subspecialty. We have a dear friend, Dr. Anand Subramaniam, who is himself a very accomplished vitreoretinal surgeon, and he's going to present a retina case. We have none other than Dr. Kumar, doctor himself today. He's going to present an interesting case regarding cataract surgery. And then we have, last but not the least, Dr. Nishita Agarwala, madam, senior consultant at Hinduja Hospital, along with Dr. Rashmi Shukla, who also is a consultant, both of them with special interest in cornea. They are going to present a case on cornea. So without further delay, I'll ask Dr. Savri Desai to start her presentation.
Thank you, Preetham. Thank you, Swapnesh. Thank you, BOA. You guys have been doing a fabulous job. So I'll just share my screen, please. Yes, can it be seen?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. So my topic for today is an eye for an eye. So let's see what that means. So this is a patient who walks into your OPD. She looks quite fine. And then what if I tell you that she's had an injury to her right eye and she actually has no eyeball? But you can go on to say that she not only doesn't have an eyeball, but she doesn't really have much of a socket. There's no phonesis. There's not much of a conjunctiva. So this is what really walks into any of our clinics. A retinoblastoma child who may have had an enucleation without an implant, an extruded implant, or a conformer which is misplaced. Retinoblastoma child may have undergone a radiation in the past, or a patient with trauma with multiple surgeries, either evisceration or enucleation done, and infections, usually such as endophthalmitis related as seen in the patient above, and orbital implant exposure due to infection. So any of these can come in your clinics. So what does this mean? So contracted socket is defined as the shrinkage and shortening of all or part of an orbital tissue, causing decrease in depth of the phonesis and orbital volume, ultimately leading to inability to retain prosthesis. So these are all cases of contracted socket where the person has lost an eye, and it remains a challenge for almost all oculoplasty surgeons, not only because the goal is to provide cosmesis, but because you need to also have some amount of functionality. So let's take this lady here. What are the features? She's had an injury with a needle, underwent multiple procedures, and this is how she looks currently. So classical features are shrinkage of the conjunctival tissues with deep scarring underneath, loss of and obliteration of both the phonesis, a deep superior sulcus, and a pseudotosis classical of something called as a post-enucleation socket syndrome. So this is a classification by Gopal Krishna published in 1980, which is almost used by everybody. And it is really nice and so simple because anybody can assess and evaluate it in their clinic. It only deals with phonesis, the lower and the upper, and the conjunctiva, and you have to assess the surface and the volume. So what are the management goals when we are dealing with such patients? One is to provide volume, of course, as is shown in the assessment, and the surface. to see that you give enough volume so as to support a prosthesis which at least has about 50 to 70% of movements, which is what they want. And that cosmetically it looks acceptable, which is what they're doing, because this is almost like a social stigma and also can have a big, has a very detrimental effect on their confidence, especially the younger patients. So the classification is broadly classified into 0 to 5 grades. But to break it down very simply, 0 and grade 1 are usually good sockets, which only maybe a little bit of low phonics involvement and can be fixed with a phonics formation suture or deepened with phonics formation suture. But however, as you go to 2 and 3, there is some amount of surface loss, volume loss of the conjunctiva, and loss of phonesis. So you need to replace that with either mucous membrane, skin, or dermis fat grafts. But as you go to the real severe ones, you need to replace the large amount of volume and we've seen in the previous cases. So here is a mild contracted socket. She has a good amount of volume. Her fornices are well formed, but the lower fornix was shallow. So we just needed to correct the lower fornix and did not need to do the rest, as was seen here in phonics formation sutures. But it is these which are a challenge. Now, dermis fat graft has been around since around the 1970s when it was first described by Petrelli and Smith. And then there are innumerable publications talking about the pros and the cons also. And there's enough literature to support it to be able to do it and produce it. So it can be used as a primary procedure following enucleation or evisceration, or a secondary procedure, or for contracted sockets. So what is a dermis fat graft? This is what a dermis fat graft looks like, rather colorful. So you have the top part, which is the dermis, which provides the surface, and the bottom part, which provides the volume, or which is the fat. Fat is basically everywhere, so it helps. So coming back to this lady and another young boy who was 5 years at the time of presentation, 4.5, and was a case of retinoblastoma. So before any procedure in a contracted socket, especially in tumors, you want to do a imaging, either a CT scan, MRI, or even a simple USG to see there is no mass behind, especially in intraocular tumors. As you can see here, the socket is an anophthalmic socket, only the muscles are seen, and there is no globe and no remnant of any tumor. So surgery, this surgery is a lengthy surgery, and what helps is doing a step-by-step surgical thing. This is almost like watching a video. So what we really do is, after retracting, we take an incision from the medial to the lateral canthus to separate it out and remove all the scar tissue, but we don't extend it to the ends because the graft takes blood supply from the base and the sides of the eyelid and the base of the fat. So you can see that it's separated out. And then using a blunt needle, you separate out or break down all the fibrous tissue. Now, once that is done, you have to assess the fornices. And here you can see one fornix formation suture is already passed. However, when you're passing, you pass it between the lid and the fornix, hook the periosteum. And this is really the important thing in doing this step, is bringing it out at the rim so as to actually create that effect of the Lockwood ligament again and create the fornix. So similarly, it is repeated on all three lower side, all the three sides, central, medial, and lateral in the inferior fornix so as to create the fornix, and superiorly. Once that is done, measurements are taken in vertical and horizontal planes, and the graft can be harvested either from the gluteal region, paraumbilical, or on the underside of the arm. I prefer the gluteal region because the scar is within the what we call the bikini line, and it provides enough fat, and usually the umbilical area in children does not have much fat. So once that is done, you measure it about 25 to 30% more, larger than the space. You inject it with lignocaine so as to create a pearly orange appearance. And you start taking off the epidermis nicely with a blade. And that is final harvesting of your graft. And you suture the wound. So this is a dermis fat graft. And you can see very clearly the full thickness of the dermis for the surface and the volume which is provided by the fat. Now, initially, it looks a bit challenging to put it in, and afterwards, it just fits in slowly and snugly. So much so that you can actually start, as you start suturing it, it settles in nicely, and everything around, as you can see, the fullness around the tissues start forming. All the deformities sort of going away, and the fat starts absorbing all those empty spaces. And this is how it looks when it's done. And a conformer is placed, the sutures are tied, and even the eyelids are sutured with a tarsorrhaphy. So this is how the patient look, and the graft usually heals over a period of 6 to 12 weeks. That's 2 to 3 months. And this is the stages here. You can see the graft whitish yellowish with sutures intact. And you can see the margins of the blood vessels creeping from the underlying conjunctiva, fat and overlying conjunctiva. And that is how finally it looks. But is DFG the gold standard? Well, not necessarily, because a contracted socket in an RB child with radiation can be quite a challenge, as is seen in this young girl. She came to me in 2007. We did a dermis fat graft. As you can see, the graft is melting. It failed. We repeated another graft. And finally, we managed to give her a much better prosthesis, although she still had a shrunken appearance. Coming back to the child, this is him after his dermis fat graft. This is his dermis fat graft when he was 5 years old. The prosthesis looks a little larger, as they have not made a customized prosthesis and use his stock prosthesis. But on follow-up, the graft remains and grows as the child grows, stimulating orbital growth, mimicking an eyeball and giving good movements, which is the beauty of the dermis fat graft. And this is him at 11 years. And the graft also is well vascularized and in situ. Coming to this 56-year-old lady with a needle injury, after years of living like this, finally with a dermis fat graft, and that is her now with her dermis fat graft and prosthesis. And a gentleman who had an RB and was enucleated without an implant, and currently his prosthesis. So does one shoe fit all? Of course not. You have to tailor it to each individual. It may not be DFG, but it doesn't mean when you lose an eye, you don't have to replace it with a prosthetic eye. So a medical literature proves that dermis fat graft works well if done properly. The main thing is it's an autologous graft. It has very good long-term results and gives good functionality and cosmesis. Thank you so much.
Thank you, madam. What wonderful photos you showed. And first time I didn't miss the video. The photos were so clear, so vivid. Thank you for an excellent presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.
We go on to our next speaker. I would invite, can you hear me? My video is not streaming.
No, we can hear you, Sapnesh.
Okay. Our next speaker is Dr. Himalini Saman, and she would speak on lateral rectus palsy, a sign or diagnosis. Welcome, madam.
This is the first thing. Can you hear me?
Yes, madam, clear.
Okay. Thank you, BOA, for giving me this opportunity. So this is an interesting case of a pediatric lateral rectus palsy. This was a 6-year-old village girl, and she noticed double vision. She complained to her school teacher. The school teacher looked at her, felt that the eye was squinting, and so brought her to us. On examining and questioning her parents, there was no history of any prior fever. There was no history of fall, any head trauma, any recent vaccination, or any other systemic illness. The double vision was constant, it was horizontal, and it disappeared on covering one eye, which meant that the child had binocular diplopia. There was no associated headache and no other neurological abnormality. The overall health of this child was very good. She was a perfectly active child. So this is how she looked in the primary gaze. She had a right convergent squint, as you notice in this picture. And on checking the abduction, she had an abduction deficit in the right eye, which was suggestive of a right lateral rectus palsy. So on examination, her vision was 6/6 in both the eyes. The pupils were circular and reacting. On cover test, she had a right-sided convergent squint with central fixation. On checking her extraocular movements, there was an abduction limitation in the right eye. The rest of the movements in the right eye were full. The left eye was normal. There was no evidence of any nystagmus. The fundus was normal. There was no evidence of any disc edema. So when you see a child like this, with this kind of history, what are the differentials that you should keep in mind? So the first thing, the reason I've highlighted SOL in red is because one of the commonest causes of pediatric lateral rectus palsy is a tumor, followed by inflammation, then infection, demyelination, and myasthenia is something that you will keep in mind if your neuroimaging is normal. So the approach that we took was that tumor being the commonest cause for lateral rectus palsy in children, particularly posterior fossa tumors, we decided to neuroimage her with MRI and contrast. The other differentials, like I mentioned, trauma, inflammation, infection, demyelination, and myasthenia must be kept in mind. So on doing an MRI with a contrast, we found this kind of a pachymeningitis on the temporal side, and there was enhancement of the sixth nerve, as you see in this picture. So pachymeningitis with enhancement of the sixth nerve, it shortens the differentials to mainly inflammation. So what are the two inflammatory conditions that you should keep in mind? Number one is sarcoidosis, and number two is IgG4 related diseases. The second differential that you should keep in mind is, could this child be having an infective cause? And our country being endemic to tuberculosis, this would be my first differential. So we started investigating this child. We started with the basics. So her blood counts were absolutely normal. Her ESR was normal. Unfortunately, although we suspected an IgG4 disease, we could not, we could not do this test because of paucity of funds. Serum ACE was negative, suggestive that there was no sarcoid. TB being endemic was extensively investigated. So we did the quantiferon test, we did the gene test, the CT scan, all three were normal. We went ahead and did a CSF tap. This was normal. There was no increase in the protein or lactate levels, suggesting that there was no infection, and the MTB test was also negative. So now what next? Since everything was normal, this case was jointly being managed by me and another pediatric neurologist, and she was very, very keen to know what caused this pachymeningitis and this inflammation of the sixth nerve. Although I was very keen on starting the steroids right away, she said and insisted that without knowing what the diagnosis is, we should not start the steroids. So going by what she said, we decided to do a brain biopsy. So now a neurosurgeon comes into the picture, and we did a brain biopsy. The biopsy report, unfortunately, was inconclusive. It only showed non-specific inflammatory cells, but nothing specific. So now it had been a month since the child had presented with a lateral rectus palsy, and I was worried that the medial rectus would go into contracture. And hence, since everything was normal, including the biopsy, we decided to start her on IV methylprednisolone for 3 days. On day 3, there was recovery of abduction, and after 3 days, the patient was started on oral steroids with a very, very slow taper. Currently, the patient is still on steroids, but a very low dose. This is the post-treatment picture. The eye is straight. The eye is straight, and there's no abduction limitation. And this was the post-treatment MRI. This was pre-treatment where you saw the pachymeningitis, and post-treatment you see the resolving of the pachymeningitis. So what was the diagnosis? Why is this an X-file case? Now, unfortunately, in this patient, we could not get the IG4, like I said, because the patient is not affording. And it responded to to the steroids very quickly, and therefore the cause was definitely some inflammation. But the points to discuss and why this is an X-file case is, let's look at these questions and answers. So neurosarcoid and IG4 diseases in children are not uncommon. What are IG4 related diseases? It is a lymphoplasmatic chronic inflammation characterized by inflammation of the lymphocytes and the IG4 plasma cells, followed by fibrosis. It can affect almost any part of the body, and the orbit is commonly affected. To what extent will you investigate for TB? So TB being endemic in India must be extensively investigated before starting the steroids. Imagine if this patient had TB and you had started steroids, it would have been a disaster. Was biopsy really necessary? So when the pediatric neurologist suggested that we must do a biopsy, I was a little conservative and questioned her, why is the biopsy really necessary? So she explained to me that since we didn't have any diagnosis on the blood counts and every other test was negative, we needed to establish what the cause was, and definitely a histopathological diagnosis was necessary before we started any treatment. How long does one have to give steroids in children? So lateral rectus palsy in children can be recurrent. And here, the cause being unclear, I would continue a maintenance dose for a long time and watch for any other signs in the future. So the take-home message is that every pediatric cranial nerve palsy must be neuroimaged. This case highlights the need for good communication between the ophthalmologist and the radiologist. Means that when you see a lateral rectus palsy and you're asking for an MRI, you must communicate with the radiologist what you're suspecting and what the radiologist needs to look for. The next comes in picture is the pediatric neurologist. Discuss the case with the neurologist, tell her your eye findings, tell her that there was no presence of nystagmus, that the pupils were normal, the disc edema was not there. So these easily rule out SOL. The next communication comes with the neurosurgeon. Now, what happened in this case is that in spite of me speaking to the neurosurgeon and telling him the brief history and what we were suspecting and what we needed to look for, the neurosurgeon unfortunately did the biopsy. It was probably done by an assistant. Not enough matter of the brain was taken. So only the dura was taken, but not really the brain tissue. And hence, we didn't get a conclusive diagnosis. And last person who was involved in this case was the pathologist. He should also be told what we're looking for, what we're suspecting, whether in the brain tissue that we sent him, he has to look for an IG4 kind of pattern or a TB pattern. So communication is very important to reach a good diagnosis. Myasthenia is a differential that I will always keep in mind and definitely investigate, but only if the neuroimaging is normal. Lateral rectus palsy with disc edema is a false localizing sign. So when you get a lateral rectus palsy, don't forget to look at the fundus. Document the presence or absence of disc edema. If you find disc edema, then after the MRI, you need to do an MRV and followed by an LP. Post-vaccination lateral rectus palsy in children is not uncommon. So whether the child has received a live attenuated vaccine or otherwise, history of vaccination is important. Post-vaccine lateral rectus palsies recover very quickly. Make sure that it is indeed a lateral rectus palsy and not a Duane's syndrome. Believe me, Duane's syndrome is very commonly misdiagnosed as a lateral rectus palsy, particularly in a child. And it's also confused with a long-standing EZO with abduction limitation. So here the tip is, look at the old photographs, take an accurate history, and in Duane's, very often the mother will complain of squinting in the normal eye. Thank you.
Thank you, madam, for an interesting case. Madam, we always look forward to your presentation because at the end of the presentation, you always give a flow chart or an algorithm about that particular topic, which is really the take-home message.
Thank you, Swapnish.
Our next speaker is Dr. Anand Subramaniam. Sir is a VR consultant at Bachwali Hospital, and often he is approached by young retina surgeons for difficult cases in their OPD, like me, to manage the case further. Over to you, Anand, sir.
Thank you, Swapnish. Thank you, Pritam. Thank you, BOA, for inviting me to be part of this webinar. Is my screen seen and am I audible?
Yes, sir.
So we have solved two of the greatest questions which mankind is facing during the lockdown. Is my screen visible and am I audible?
Yes, sir.
So the X files which we have is of retina. So whenever Hema speaks, whatever she speaks is X files for us. It always goes above our head. So if it's even more complicated, then we are totally lost. So this is a very simple case of retina, which usually walks into a retina clinic or a normal clinic of a general ophthalmologist. So I'd like to acknowledge my senior resident, Dr. Bindya. So that is the advantage of being in a teaching hospital. You can ask them to make your slides for you. So this 43-year-old lady walks into a retina clinic. She has a decreased vision in the right eye since 15 days. No systemic illnesses. Otherwise, she's healthy. Her vision has dropped down to 6/12 in the affected eye. Otherwise, everything else is normal. So we do the fundus examination. The patient has been referred to us with a query diagnosis of macular edema. So you can see that there is some amount of fluid over here in the right eye. The left eye is absolutely normal. So this is the whole picture of the right eye. You can see some amount of subretinal fluid, maybe a little bit of yellowish lesion over here, which is suspect. So what we do, routinely any ophthalmologist worth his or her salt does nowadays is an OCT. So the OCT was done. So you have a nice area pocket of subretinal fluid. So I think we have a clear-cut case of central serous retinopathy. So we were quite happy that yes, the patient was referred as macular edema. We found out that it is central serous retinopathy. So the thing that helps us right now after making the diagnosis is that in central serous retinopathy, you're not supposed to give any steroids. So when the patient was on difluprednate, we were very happy. We said, "Ha, ye sab band karo abhi." But the point why this patient has been kept for X files is that this is not the end of the story. So whenever you get a patient with any of these things, look at all the scans. This scan is going vertically through the macula. You're seeing this. But if you see this scan, what do you find over there? So let's highlight that thing. So if you see this, you have this thing known as a contact sign. If you look closely, the retinal Brooks membrane RP layer has been lifted up, and there is a contact between the neurosensory retina and the Brooks membrane over here. So this is something that is not seen in central serous retinopathy. So if we go ahead and take a scan not through the fovea and through certain other areas, you can see that the choroid has been lifted up substantially over here with the contact sign over here. So this gives you a different picture. So it is not a simple case of central serous retinopathy. This case, we did not do an FFA. What we did was a ultrasound B scan, where you can see a choroidal thickness over here right next to the area at the macular region. With these in mind, what we did was these tests, and this is a routine baseline test which we do for uveitis. So which showed us that the MANTU was very strongly positive. So with this features and a laboratory investigation which is strongly suggestive of tuberculosis, we can safely label this as tuberculous choroiditis. We started the patient on AKT followed by oral steroids. And within 2 weeks, the lesion is completely resolved. So what are the points of discussion? Why have we kept this patient for X files? So this is the case in discussion where it looks very clear. While this is a case of actual CSR, if you look at it, I would say that this is more tuberculous because there's a lot of RP damage in this case. And if you look at the OCTs, you have to be very carefully watching the OCTs where you can see the contact sign and you can see the choroid elevated, while this is a normal CSR OCT where the Brooks membrane and RP level are intact and static, and maybe you might have a pachychoroid also below it. So not all macular lesions are macular edemas. When we take the OCT, everyone has got OCT now at their clinic. But the thing is that the OCT has to pass through the proper area of interest. If it is taken right at the fovea or your optometrist is taking the OCT, you should go and tell them to take it through the area of interest. And ancillary tests, we all have OCTs, we all have FFAs, we have so many things, but not all of them needs to be done in all cases. We didn't do FFA for this case. What is important about tuberculous choroiditis is, again, it mimics a lot of lesions in the eye. So anything, first, like Dr. Hema just said, that we have to rule out tuberculous etiology in most of the cases. So once it is safely ruled out, we can do other things. But if it is tuberculous, we need to start the patient on AKT. Only then can we take up the patient for steroids. Tuberculous choroiditis vis-a-vis a CSR is that it causes permanent, irreversible visual damage. And the treatment modality is systemic treatment, which lasts for 6 to 9 months. So a lot of chair time is taken by these patients. I think questions we can take up later on.
Thank you, sir.
Quite an interesting case, Anand. I think this just shows that just having an OCT is not enough. It is very important to take time, look at the OCT picture, and more importantly, if your vision is not coinciding with the pathology, then you should look at various scans of the OCT, not just one particular scan. So I think there'll be interesting discussion on this case later on, I'm sure. So shall we proceed, Sapnesh? Next is Dr.
Yes, sir.
Kumar, doctor, right? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Kumar, please share your screen so we can start your case.
Sir's topic is, do I fish out? And he is very close to Gateway of India.
Oh, wow.
At the onset, I would like to thank Swapnesh, Preetham, and the whole team of BOA to have invited me for this seminar. Question here is, do I fish this IOL out or not? There's a big question. So sometimes in life, we do face difficulties, and this can happen to anybody. It's a rainy season, so you have to be a little careful when this happens. But now the question is what to do when this comes. Now, this patient was operated by me only 14 years back. Some of you might not know this, but that time that was available was a twin set bifocal IOL. It was called a 733 and a 737. So one was a distant dominant and one was a near dominant. And I found that the IOL is not in position. There was a YAG opening. The original sticker of the power of the IOL was there. And now the patient wants multifocality. So I want to show you a clinical picture as to how it is really. So very, very important take-home message is see the patient if they have a multifocal IOL undilated. And this is how the patient came to me. So you can see multiple rings there. And these rings are actually just in the center and you can make out that it is completely off. But this really doesn't give you what the real picture is. So let us now dilate this patient. And this patient was allergic to Tropicacil Plus. So all we could use was only Cyclogic. And this is what it was. So you can see when you dilate this patient, this is what all you can see. So you can see there is an opening in the YAG here, IOL which is down. This is the size of the pupil that is maximum. There was vitreous coming out from here. So now the question is what next to do. So question here is patient wants multifocality. What are our options and how to manage this? So I went ahead and did surgery for this patient under topical anesthesia. The first thing is, of course, to put intracameral epitrate and see. Now you can see the optic-haptic junction. This is the optic-haptic junction. This haptic is missing. We don't know where is the other haptic. I know the design of the IOL. We are putting intracameral epitrate and see how much the pupil really dilates. So here the pupil is slightly dilate and we can see two haptics now appearing. So one haptic here is between the anterior capsule that's in the bag. One haptic is at a different level. The optic is sitting somewhere else and there's a nice opening that is done right in the center. So once that is done, I'm going to go ahead and put intracameral Kinacort. Once that is done, I'm going to go ahead and make my main incision and start my vitrectomy. And you can see the whole disc of the lens rotating. Now, don't forget, this was a multifocal or a bifocal IOL then. This is many, many years back. And now patient wants multifocality. So what are our real options? So here I'm doing a vitrectomy, removing all the vitreous that was there. And then coming to explantation is very, very important to be able to hold the IOL before we make a cut. Don't forget to use a good viscoelastic, and you can see that I'm using a viscoelastic to protect the endothelium that's between the IOL and the endothelium. Once that is done, the lens is stabilized, and then we go ahead with a micro grasping forceps in the left hand, and in the other hand, I'm taking a micro scissors and I'm making a cut. So you don't need to cut through and through all the way through and through, because now I'm going to use the incision itself as a fulcrum. So here I'm just removing a little piece of the IOL that actually got separated from the main body. Remove that. Once that is done, I'm going ahead and then holding the IOL with the micro grasping forceps. And I'm using the incision as a fulcrum and rotating this disc out of the eye. So I'm rotating it. You will see it gently rotated out. And the whole 6 millimeter optic is out through a 3.1 millimeter incision, or you can even do it through a 3 millimeter incision. Now, one haptic is anterior in the sulcus, right? So what to do with that? So you will see that also. And the other haptic is between the anterior capsule and the, don't forget, this is a YAG opening done. Okay, so there is a posterior capsule and the periphery is already sealed. So you can see a little bit of anterior capsule rim, and that is where this haptic is. And this haptic is anterior, so I'm going to hold that haptic and remove it out. So once that is out, I'm going to go ahead and take in another IOL, again do a little bit of vitrectomy, okay, fill in the anterior chamber with a viscoelastic, and now take a 3-piece Tecnis multifocal IOL. And this has to be injected inside the eye, and you'll see that is being injected into the sulcus. Don't forget, any multifocal IOL has to be very, very well centered. Otherwise, the situation is going to be exactly the same with what the patient came to us with. So I'm injecting the 3-piece multifocal Tecnis IOL, no financial interest. This goes into the sulcus, and the other haptic also goes into the sulcus. Now, very important to capture the optic with that opening that was made in the CCC. Rather, I wouldn't say CCC, that was the YAG opening that was in the posterior capsule. So you can see inferiorly, the whole capsule complex bag has come anterior to the IOL, and this is the superior area where the anterior posterior capsule bag complex is above. So I've actually captured the optic, the haptic being in the sulcus into the position. Now this IOL is a multifocal IOL. It will never ever decenter. Let the patient do what he or she wants. This IOL will never decenter, do any viscoelastic or vitreous anything remaining in the anterior chamber. So here the take-home message is, please examine the eye undilated to see the position of a multifocal IOL if the patient is unhappy with the quality of vision. So that's very, very important. Do not do a YAG capsulotomy. Many times the patient comes to you dilated in a multifocal IOL and we just go ahead and do a YAG. So please do not do any YAG capsulotomy in such patients. Dilate and examine and reassess. Patients will prefer to have same type of vision back. So if the patient is used to multifocality, give it to them. Patient wants monovision, give it to them. Patient wants only uniocular vision for distance and near, whatever the patient has had, that we continue to give. Make sure that you fix the new IOL in place. There are a lot of options available to us. We could have done a posterior iris fixation, a sulcus fixation, or in the back fixation, a glued or a Yamane or a dumbbell technique. But as you saw here, I captured the IOL, which was a multifocal IOL in the back complex. Of course, if vitrectomy necessary, please go ahead and do vitrectomy. Calculation of the IOL entirely depends on the condition that was there. I'll show you one more case here where I'm going to show you a subluxation of the IOL in the back complex. And you can see the patient came to me like this. When the patient came to me, patient says could not see well. And patient also said that when I lie down, I can see very well. But when I sit up, I can't see. So what happens when the patient is dilated? In a sitting position, you can see a whole back complex here. So you can see the back complex. This is the endocapsular ring. This is the haptic, and this is the optic. And then you can see a CCC margin that is there, very well seen. So this is a back complex which has gone down. So what are our real options here? What can we really do? One is, of course, note the position of the endocapsular ring, note the position of the IOL, note the CCC. One option is to explant this whole complex. Either glue in another IOL, do a posterior iris fixation, or we can do what I did, which was completely different. And you can see the movement of the whole bag when the patient is sitting. So I asked the patient to look right and left. You can see the whole complex move. And there was a sunset kind of a thing. But when the patient lies down, this whole complex comes in the middle and patient could actually see reasonably okay. But in a sitting position, the whole back complex went down and you can see the whole pseudodonesis, phacodonesis that is happening there. Went ahead and did surgery. This was not topical anesthesia. This is with a block supported from the posterior. So as you can see, when the patient lies down, the whole back complex comes beautifully horizontal. And that's the reason why the patient could see. I made 2 marks. I'm going to do a Hoffman's pocket on the side. Go ahead and make the Hoffman's pocket. And once that is done, I'm doing a railroad technique. So first, I'm going to pass a 9O Prolene from below the endocapsular ring and the haptic. Okay. And then pass the needle. So this first railroad technique is going from below. The other pass that is going to happen in the needle is going to be above the endocapsular ring and the haptic junction. So this is the inferior one. So once that is happening through and through, I'm going ahead and passing. And now the second needle that we are going to pass is from above. So the needle goes above the endocapsular ring and the haptic complex. So I'm actually looping with the 9O Prolene. I would have preferred to have Gore-Tex here, but this is what was available then. And I'm going to go ahead and then suture it. Now the same thing is going to be done. Now you can see that I'm going to tighten this suture. So I'm actually holding it. And now I'm going on the other side. Okay, you can see the whole back complex move. Don't forget to hold the same part. So if that's the area where you selected the endocapsular ring, I'm going below the endocapsular ring and below the haptic. Again, passing a railroad technique, going through and then passing in another one from above. And at the end of the procedure, you will see that the whole back complex is very well centered. And I'll show you the first day post-op images that this complex really holds on. And this is a Hoffman's pocket. So again, the suture will be removed and tied and it will get buried. The conjunctiva can be sutured or glued, whatever you want. And you can see at the end of the procedure, we are tying the knot, again, tightening it a bit at that stage. We'll tighten the other side. And when we tighten it, the back complex beautifully centers and you can see a well-centered bag. Let's look at this images first day post-op. And you can see the images here. Let's see this. So this is the first day post-op. You can see the conjunctival sutures on the side, that is here, a very good quiet eye. This is the other side. And this patient, of course, did very well. So what's the take-home message? Listen to the patient, reassess the condition, think of all the options that you have, and be prepared for all. So you have to keep a backup with a vitreoretinal surgeon, stand by, record all the cases if possible, explain to the patients all the possibilities, and do not be worried. I would have preferred to use Gore-Tex as a different material in such a case scenario, but I had the 9-O-Prolene there, so I went ahead and did this. So thank you very much, all of you, for your attention in 2 cases that I discussed. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kumar. It's always a pleasure to watch your videos. All your legendary videos we've been seeing in ophthalmic Premier Leagues. Thank you again. And now over to our last section, that is the cornea section. And Dr. Nishita and Dr. Rashmi, can we have your presentation on?
So can you hear me?
Yes. Before Dr. Nishita starts, just another to all our viewers, we would encourage you all to write down any questions or send us any questions on the links that you're watching this webinar. All your questions will be discussed, because we will be having a discussion at the end of after Dr. Nishita's presentation. Dr. Nishita, please go ahead.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Dr. Rashmi and I would like to thank BOA, Dr. Samant and Dr. Swapnesh for this opportunity to present an episode in the X-Files series. We all know that the burden of microbial keratitis is very high, and there is often an "ooh, my sight" moment when the patient comes to the doctor's office. They fear loss of sight. One such devastating infection is pythium keratitis. So here's our story. The mystery begins when a patient, a young healthy female, comes to our clinic in October 2019. During the Ganpati festivities, she had got injured with some vegetative matter. Her referring surgeon had started her on antifungal treatment based on a positive fungal smear. She showed excellent compliance, despite which the ulcer kept increasing. When she comes to us, we see this ulcer with a hypopion, and we repeated the KOH, and the pathology lab reported fungal element. So all we did was that we added voriconazole to the natamycin that she was already on. But to our dismay, within 4 or 5 days, things were so terrible that it warranted a therapeutic keratoplasty. We had to just go ahead and do one. A large therapeutic graft was done, which involved the margins of the ulcer. 2 PIs are always necessary when you do such a large graft to prevent glaucoma formation later on, and 24 interrupted sutures were taken. This surgery was done under general anesthesia. As always, the donor button was cut in half and sent for microbiology and histopathology. And what really puzzled us was the etiology. So we went back and reviewed the slit lamp photos on the same day and asked our pathologists what they were seeing. They confirmed our suspicion of pythium, and immediately post-operatively, linezolid eye drops were instituted on a 1-hourly regime. To our surprise and relief, the clinical picture improved dramatically in 3 days. As you can see on the first picture, there was a lot of fibrin on the first post-op day, but this cleared, and by day 4, the view of the anterior chamber was considerably better. So what is pythium? It is a pseudofungus, and it differs from the fungus because its cell wall does not contain ergosterol or chitin. This is why antifungals are not as effective in the treatment of pythium keratitis. In fact, not at all effective. So there were some red flags that were staring us in the face. A positive fungal smear, and despite antifungal medication, the condition was worsening. And on review of the slit lamp photos, some typical clinical signs were evident. So what are these typical clinical signs that allowed us to differentiate between fungal and pythium? The tentacles are seen. Let's go back, Rashmi, one slide. So our patient showed these tentacles and pinpoint infiltrates. There was a plaque formation, peripheral guttering of the cornea near the limbus, and also, of course, thinning. The hypopion remained as it was in the few days that we had moved her, included the voriconazole into her treatment regime. So what are these typical ones that were so elegantly captured in the IJO article by Hasika et al.? The things to remember here are, in a pythium, there are the 3 P's and the T to look for. Pinpoint infiltrates, plaque formation, peripheral thinning and guttering, and the infiltrates which look like tentacles, which are in the mid-stroma. So the pathologists suspected pythium, and it always helps in cementing a clinical diagnosis. We, like Hema and so many of the others have said, that you always need to collaborate with your colleagues and other specialties. It was our presence in the lab and discussion with them that helped us seal the diagnosis. Since our pathologists had not seen too many pythiums, they also sent the material to another lab for confirmation. So on microbiology, these hyphae, which sort of points towards a diagnosis of fungus, are actually very different. These hyphae are broad and ribbon-like, and they branch at right angles. And the most important thing being that they are mostly aseptate. On the media, this pythium grows very rapidly, very fluffy, and it actually invades the media just like it invades the cornea. Zoospores can also be seen, but our microbiologist was not able to identify them. What happens in histopathology? The stains do pick up these organisms, and there are eosinophilic granulocytes that are seen. These are seen very faintly on the H&E stain, whereas in a fungus, these are the H&E stain really stains very brightly. The GMS and the PAS stains can also be used, but the 100% specific and sensitive stain is the iodine potassium iodide sulfuric acid stain, and this helps us differentiate it from fungus. We have spoken to our laboratories and they think that they will be able to get us this stain the next time we suspect pythium. Antifungals fail due to differences in the cell wall structure, as we had discussed. Until 2015, the surgery was the only outcome, was the only way out due to poor outcomes of medical treatment. But linezolid and azithromycin are promising and help in the resolution of the ulcer and control of the ulcer. But the in vitro susceptibility to tigecycline and minocycline is also being tested. The recommended medical treatment outlined by Bagga et al. In the BJO and Ramappa et al. In cornea has been the topical use of 0.2% linezolid eye drops and the topical and oral use of azithromycin for the treatment of pythium keratitis. If this fails, then of course therapeutic keratoplasty needs to be done. So this is our patient today. Her last follow-up was on the 20th of January. She maintains 2 meters vision. The eye is quiet. The intraocular pressure has been maintained, and the posterior segment is still virgin. We insisted on a very close follow-up, and with the judicial use of steroids post the infection simmering down, the eye is now salvaged. Post-lockdown, she has been using WhatsApp to keep in touch with us, and some of the photographs are very encouraging, and we hope that one day we might be able to restore her vision by an optical graft. So what are the take-home messages? Look for the 3 P's and the T. Collaborate with the microbiologist and your pathologist. Medical therapy is promising with linezolid and azithromycin. If this fails, therapeutic keratoplasty should be done without delay. There is a very high recurrent rate of recurrence of the pythium. So be very cautious when you use steroid postoperatively. Of course, if you are not sure, please take the help of a friend. And there are lots of new articles that have come up since 2014 onwards on pythium keratitis. I'd like to thank Dr. Bhupesh Banga for that excellent talk that he did a few months ago on bugsters through the LVPI Institute. I spoke to Dr. Gokhale, Dr. Mehta, Hijab Mehta, and Dr. P. Suresh prior to this talk, and they gave me some interesting and input, which I had included in the talk as we went along. So treating the pythium was like an X-file for us. But perhaps the X-file of the decade is COVID-19. But the truth is out there, and that is where doctors and researchers stand above the rest in our mission to treat and cure. Thank you, everyone. If we want to continue, Rashmi can talk a little bit about the COVID manifestations, Dr. Swapnesh.
Pritam sir, should we go ahead with COVID
Yes,
manifestations?
yes. Yeah, firstly, wonderful case, Dr. Nishita. That was really an eye-opener.
Thank you.
And very nicely put together. I think it will be for our viewership. It will definitely be of a lot of interest to hear about COVID-19 and in association with our with cornea and all these problems. So Rashmi, please go ahead. No.
Thank you, sir, and thank you to the VOA for allowing us for this talk. And yes, like as Madam said, so when we come to cornea, our X-files are always infections. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So our X-files are mainly infections, because every time there's a new infection, there's like, are we going to get the organism? Even if we get the organism, are we going to be going on a right track in terms of treatment? So one of the main X-file cases for us in cornea is all infections that come to us. And with these times, COVID-19 is one of the main X-file cases. So a little bit. So we have this one patient actually, and presented to us with conjunctival hyperemia, and the patient said that there's early morning when he gets up, he has a little discharge and stickiness. The redness is more when he wakes up in the morning, and this is unilateral, and this is persisting since the last 14 days, 2 to 3 weeks. And this is the first photo that the patient sent to us from home. But after 2 weeks, we did start steroids after 2 weeks, but then we wanted to do a pressure check. We wanted to actually have a look at the cornea. So we called him, and these are the photos that we took from close. Not really slit lamp photos, but we took these from close. And we could see these follicles. And the patient did have other symptoms of, fatigue and a little low-grade fever. And he went ahead and got tested and was positive for COVID-19. Now, I must say that in this patient, the presenting feature was not only conjunctivitis. He had both things, like he presented with conjunctivitis and the malaise and the fever. So coming to the ocular manifestations, now, whatever I am talking, these are basically from 2 articles that are published, and many of that is also anecdotal. So one article that is published is in the NEJM, and over there they have tested around close to 1,000 patients, and out of that only 0.8% presented with conjunctival hyperemia or conjunctivitis. However, this was not the presenting symptom, so only 0.8, only about 7 patients. The other article is from the Chinese group from Wuhan, and they tested about 38 patients, and close to 32% of those patients presented with ocular manifestation. Again, important thing to note here is that only one patient had the presenting feature of COVID as the ocular symptom, which was epiphora. Rest, all other patients, the eye findings were along with other systemic manifestations. Now, other important thing to note is what they have reported is the patients who have had ocular manifestations with COVID are the ones who will have a more inflammatory picture, like the disease may be more moderate to severe systemically. Also, when their blood markers are done, the blood markers are also like the inflammatory profile is more than the other COVID patients. So something to say that the inflammatory manifestations are much more in these patients. Now coming to the positivity, we want to know that so all these patients who had eye manifestations, they had positive nasopharyngeal swabs. Now coming to the question of whether the conjunctival swab is going to be positive. So only 2 out of those 38 patients had a positive conjunctival swab for PCR. So yes, the answer is yes. Whether is it secreted in the conjunctiva? Yes, but the positivity rate may not be so high. So as we can see, the common manifestations is an increased secretions or epiphora, which are most common, chemosis, and the less common finding is actually conjunctival hyperemia, and also some amount of one-sided eye pain, retroorbital. Often it is unilateral. We've had some anecdotal reports from colleagues and all also about blepharitis being one of the features. Now, again, I want to just make a comment that when you compare to external studies which are done outside India, in India, such a study has not been done, they have reported only 0.8%. But if we extrapolate this 0.8% to the entire Indian population, we are going to have a lot of patients, because 0.8% to the entire Indian population is going to be a lot, many numbers. So yes, ophthalmologists really have to be aware of any conjunctivitis patient. You have to suspect that this could be having a positive COVID. So let's go on to the next slide. First, I would like to thank Dr. Rohit Shetty, because he was very kind enough to share this slide with Dr. Nishita Madam, and also the same kind of algorithm is a very good article has been given by him recently in Indian Journal of Ophthalmology, reviewing a very good algorithm which all of us can read. So just in short, this algorithm, so when we have a conjunctivitis patient at this time, the first thing to ask obviously is you ask for the screen, fever, or you screen for the body temperature, and ask for other questions like, is there any history of quarantine, history of any travel to a containment zone? Now, if the answer is yes, you ask for COVID-specific systemic symptoms, specifically loss of smell, taste, fatigue, breathlessness. If the answer to any of this is yes, please refer the patient to the COVID treatment center and, of course, do a thorough cleaning. If the answer to any of this is no, the patient only has fever or any of the contact history, you still treat like you're treating a COVID suspect. So you take the resolute PPE measures, have protection, try to avoid actual slit lamp examination unless you think that the cornea may be involved. Only then, otherwise do a torchlight examination, no touch, use cotton buds, and disinfect all the equipment once the patient is left. You can just give antibiotics in the first 2 weeks. You can only give a topical antibiotic with a lubricant, and with or without a topical antibiotic. Some of us do give antibiotics. And if possible, avoid the patient going to your pharmacy. You keep a pre-packed pouch which you can hand over to the patient, so that all of this movement in the hospital is finished within a time of 10 minutes. Thereafter, after 2 weeks, you can actually get in touch with the patient over a teleconsultation or a phone or a WhatsApp and ask how are the symptoms. If the patient is feeling better, you can continue the same treatment. If not, for relief, you can add steroids. At this time, you can add a tablet azithromycin and reconsider if you want to tell the patient to go to a clinic and get himself tested if there are other symptoms. So this is like a short algorithm about COVID. So thank you very much for this.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Rashmi. Very nicely explained.
So should we go on to the questions?
Yeah, I think we have a lot of questions. So let's take up each one, right? Probably let's start from Savri. and her contracted socket case.
So there's a question to highlight the management of infection associated with conformer in place. What are the common organisms and drug of choices?
So with a conformer, ideally as such, the orbit or the conjunctiva won't have so much of an infection. It could be a lacrimal sac. So a lot of times we see Pseudomonas in that also, and but they don't really have a detrimental effect. So I would say that best, and also we see Staph aureus. These are the two common ones with a conformer. But a conformer ideally should be removed after 4 to 6 weeks. And if it's clean regular, you don't get. So best is if there is someone who is wearing a conformer with a lot of dirty discharge, which is accumulating very fast, it is advisable to do a swab and send it for testing.
Okay. On the same lines, there is a question: what are the types of artificial cosmetic eye implants recently used?
Okay, that's a long question, but what I summarize it is that we have basically two types of prosthesis. One is a stock prosthesis, which are ready-made prosthesis, which come in different sizes and colors. They're good, but they can cause a little bit of irritation and lead to an allergic conjunctivitis, which leads to a chronic discharge. And then you have the customized ocular prosthesis, which are made to your size of the socket using molds and made out of acrylic. They are much better in quality. They give much more realistic effect. Other than that, these are just prosthesis which you insert and remove. Then are the pegged prosthesis, which is different because the entire surgery process is different and is not very commonly done in India because the costs are very high.
So you would recommend acrylic as the best one?
Yes, they're customized ocular prosthesis and they cost anywhere between 10 to 20, 25,000 and even more. If you want a more realistic, you want an anterior chamber depth also, you can get one now.
So any brands or any?
No, they are done by Swapnish. They're done by Ocularis, who are trained for these, and they do an excellent job. And in fact, if it's a child and as they're growing older, they can keep building on the same prosthesis at least for a period of 2 to 5 years, without having to spend every time so much.
Okay, thanks, madam. Hema, madam, can you hear us? Yeah, there's a question regarding your case specifically. If the patient had denied brain biopsy, what would have been your approach further? And would you still go ahead with the trial of steroids in that scenario?
Okay, so that's a good question. I myself was conservative about doing the brain biopsy. It was only on the insistence of the pediatric neurologist that we decided to go ahead. Apparently, pediatric neurologists are not shy of doing biopsy. It is us who are not aware that that biopsy is a big deal and should not be done. So in this patient, she was a JJ patient, very easy to convince. But like I said, that there could be a scenario where a patient may have denied or did not go for the brain biopsy. In that case, first I would have tried to convince the patient. If the patient still denied it, I discussed with the pediatric neurologist that look, otherwise all the blood counts are normal. She doesn't have any fever. She doesn't show any active signs suggestive of any infection, tuberculosis. Her ACE has come negative. So I would have just gone ahead with IV methylprednisolone under a very close watch. I would have gone ahead with the steroids because there was no clear sign of any infection, including the LP. The LP was also normal. When you have pachymeningitis, LP is a very good test. The CSF study is a good test to tell you whether there is any infection or no. And the CSF was absolutely normal. We could have gone ahead. It was just to know what we're looking at, what the diagnosis was. And unfortunately, in this patient, not enough brain tissue was taken. It was only the dura mater which was taken and not the brain tissue. Therefore, we got inconclusive results.
Again, highlights importance of involving all other departments in a case like this.
Yeah.
Dr. Hema, you mentioned about IG4 inflammation in your presentation. So what else can IG4 inflammations, how do they present in the eye? Are there the other manifestations?
Yeah, so in the eye, it mainly affects the muscles. So the patient can present with an orbital myositis. It can affect the lacrimal glands, so like a dacroadenitis. It can affect, Savi, you want to add? It can even present as a pseudotumor. So the patient can present with a proptosis. Anything I'm missing out, Savi?
So it basically can either involve any of the orbital structures that you mentioned very rightly, or it can present as an isolated orbital mass.
Yeah, right.
The fat.
But IgG4 can affect almost any part of the body, and it typically presents as inflammation, which eventually progresses to fibrosis and a complete shutdown of that particular organ.
What does it cost? What does this test cost, Hema?
It's a couple of thousands.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Then all pseudotumors should be investigated for
ideally,
IgG4.
Yes, ideally, yes. IG4 should be kept in mind. Agree, Sabri?
Yeah, so there's two components. One is a systemic IgG4, which responds very, very well to systemic steroids. And if it's biopsy from a particular area, yields very good results, and you do a blood test. And then you have the orbital, which is a variant of its own almost and has its own behavior, which you may not get a systemic, confirmation in the blood test. So in those cases, then you need to do a biopsy, because only the histopathology features, like the ratio of plasma cells, etc., will actually present that it's an IgG4, not a
Yeah, and plus the histopathology picture has been classically described as a storiform appearance, which is like a whirl-like appearance of cells that you see.
But we do the blood test. A lot of labs do it. If I can name one of them, Metropolis does the serum IgG4, and it has
Very good.
results are very good. Yes, they are quite
Very
accurate.
good. It costs around 4,000-5,000. So.
Yes.
Okay. So should we move on to the next question?
Yeah.
Okay. The question for Anand sir. Which all CSR cases would you investigate further? Means in this case, it presented as a CSR, it was misdiagnosed as a CSR. But any pointers to a regular CSR case which should raise a red flag and you should investigate further?
All the CSRs, we should be a little bit skeptical, because CSR is a self-limiting disease, but it's a diagnosis of exclusion. Now, suppose you have a clear-cut case where you have subretinal fluid. There's a typical history of a young male patient with typical type A personality. These are all pointing towards a classical CSR case. Now, suppose you have given that person a trial and said that after 1 month you come back and see the fluid has not gone down, or you're seeing that the fluid has increased. So these are all red flags to say that this is not a simple case of CSR. Or initially when you see that there is some fluid and you see yellowish material in the subretinal space, or you see vitreous cells, or you see that the disc is not normal, you have an optic nerve pit. So these are all subtle signs. When you get some fluid, just don't restrict your view to the fluid. Look around, see if there are vitreous cells, if there's subretinal fibrin or choroiditis, there's optic nerve pit. So if these things are all there, you need further investigation.
Okay. So with the advent of OCTA, there's a question regarding what are the newer OCT signs of CSR. So probably the person who has posted is wanting to know use of OCTA in CSR.
OCTA doesn't help in CSR. You need to have a high flow leakage to see on OCTA. If it's a very slow leakage, it will never be seen on OCTA. So it's still not. I don't use OCTA at all for CSR.
So FFA is still the gold standard after waiting for 1 month in a classic case.
Of course. FFA, I don't do it in the first instance. I do it only if I'm trying to do any treatment for that case. So with the simple OCT, we can make out, but we have, like Pritam had also said just after the presentation, that you have to look carefully at the OCT and take it at different levels. If possible, do it yourself, or at least see all the scans which are there in the machine.
Pritam sir, anything to add?
Yeah. No, that's right. And I think the biggest red flag here is, we know that OCT, in CSR, it's the vision usually there's a mild diminution of vision. if anything where your visual acuity is less than 612, 618, I think that should raise a red flag. When it
Should
comes to
improve
CSR.
with hyperopia correction.
Yes, yeah, and that is also important.
Okay. So a lot of questions for Kumar sir, as expected. So one question is, in today's time, would you still go ahead with MFIOL or IHANS, which will be more forgiving? And a corollary to that, how would you choose between using a 3-piece IOL, which is very ideal in this case, versus an IHANS, which is still only available as a 1-piece IOL?
So that's the reason why you can't choose an IHANS in this case, because I want to do the haptics in the sulcus and I want to optic capture it. The only disadvantage of a 3-piece Technis multifocal comes with only with one add of a +4. So the reading is going to come a little closer to the patient than you would get in an IHANS, which will give you intermediate distance. So I don't think there is a choice of a single-piece lens in that case scenario. We had to use a 3-piece IOL. And even if I removed the full bag and tried to do a glued IOL or whatever I would have done, I would have to use a 3-piece IOL. So I felt that this was the best option that was there for this case scenario.
So probably a question by a postgraduate or a junior, highlight the do's and don'ts during loading of 3-piece IOL, because I think your case showed that there were broken haptics of 3-piece IOL.
No, yeah. So the original case that came to me was a 733 IOL, which is called a twins. It was made by a company called Acritech, which was bought over by Zeiss. Now, I've unfortunately or fortunately used a lot of these IOLs, and this is almost 19 years back. They had excellent results, but you would have recovered the cost of your YAG laser, because about 80% of them developed a PCO. Why? Because they did not have a square edge. They had a real convex edge, and that's the reason why they all developed PCO. Surprisingly, in this last 1 year, I've seen 3 of my own patients come with a disc separated from the optic haptic junction. Why this happens, I have no answer. I have put it out, but yet I have got no reply. But these are very easy to remove, as you saw, because they are silicone. You can cut it and you can remove it. So point here is that these IOLs are 3-piece IOLs. So it's optic haptic, and it's not a broken that was there. It was that they separate out from the optic haptic junction. Why they separate out? There's no history of trauma like this, or my other 2 patients never gave me history of trauma like a blunt injury or a blow or anything like that was not given at all. But surprisingly, they present the same way. One patient has presented to me with a disc lying in the anterior chamber and actually touching the endothelium and causing a problem. And this patient, luckily, was the disc sitting behind. It would never go in the vitreous because the opening was too small. So this is what I have to say, that they don't break like that, but these are old lenses which I'm seeing now over the number of years.
Sir, one more question. Do you recommend use of iris hooks to be pulled back to look at the capsular support after explantation of the, means what is your technique to ensure that there is a good capsular support?
That's very good. The very fact, here I could see a whole back complex. So you could see a CCC margin, the YAG opening. So that was actually the posterior capsule. The whole back complex could be viewed well. But suppose you have a scenario like this where the whole posterior capsule is intact, there is no YAG capsulotomy done, and the lens has got a sunset. Let's presume this. And I have cases like this. Then definitely there is something happening at the zonules inferiorly which has caused the sunset. In such case scenarios, if the pupil does not dilate, it's extremely wise to put 4 hooks. Make sure that you see the zonular support, because if you put another lens again in the sulcus without trying to capture it, it's going to sink again. So if the support inferiorly is not good, it is very important that we put 4 hooks, look at the zonular support, which is of course for the sulcus if ever we put a lens. But even in such scenarios, I would still prefer to make an opening in the posterior capsule or the back complex, go ahead and capture the optic and keep the IOL haptic in the sulcus, even if it is a scenario where the PC is intact. So I would have still done something similar.
So finally, there's also a new technique called as a paperclip technique.
Yes.
which is used by Dr. Susan
Yeah.
Jacob.
That will not work in this. For paperclip technique, you need a proper posterior capsule intact. You need a proper phonics of a lens capsule where you put in like a paper clip, and the loop that comes out is actually tucked like a glued IOL. That is good for zonular dialysis. So if you have a zonular dialysis in one half, not more than 180 degree, then you can use a paper clip. So you did not use a Sionis, but you can use a paper clip because it's much easier to use. So I would have used a paper clip if I have a zonular dialysis in 180 degree, which is I think made by Greshabyre. I don't know the cost, but it's a very good technique. You can see that on YouTube, and I've seen that, and it works quite well.
Thank you, sir. Pritam sir, anything to add?
No, I think, yeah, most of the questions have been answered. Yeah.
Yes.
By Dr.
Yes.
Kumar. Yeah.
So
There
I
is,
think we have come. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in Dr. Nishita's presentation, we have a question here. Dr. Kunjal is asking a question. In that first scraping of that Pythium case, did it show aseptate fungal filaments? That is what she has asked.
At that time, Kunjal, we had not gone to the laboratory ourselves. And since, like I said, our labs were not very familiar with what they were looking for, and they reported it as filaments, and we said, oh, okay, this is a fungus, so we went on. So that is where I think we should have collaborated a little better, and I think henceforth that is where we all must go. I think that is one of the take-home messages, that talk and collaborate with your laboratory.
Is there any evidence in literature, or that whether this Pythium is mainly causes anterior segment involvement in cornea, or is known to cause endophthalmitis also?
So far, there's been no endophthalmitis report. Okay. No report of endophthalmitis, and it's from the eye point of view, actual studies from the eye, there are only about 2 to 3, and all of them are only about the clinical profiles and outcomes in Pythium keratitis only. So in the eye, it's only Pythium keratitis reported. And one of the articles from Journal of Clinical Microbiology, they've just written that from all the Pythium infections, human infections are roughly about 41%. But most of the reported infections are only corneal. There's no endophthalmitis reported so far.
All right.
Does it come to the eye? What's the modality of this thing?
So basically, it's like, again, so everything like fungal, so aquatic, like in a coastal area, vegetative, very much just like fungal. And that's why for a long time it was thought of as a fungal infection, and that's why all the confusion. And even in our case, this confusion was because the patient came from outside, was treated elsewhere, fungal filaments were reported, and we just continued with that same thought. So that was one of the mistakes, and we should, so that there is a positive fungal report, the patient has not been responding, it's already become so large. So you have to again think of Python, especially now. The cases have taken up now since 2014. There have been a lot of cases, and India is one of the common places where we are getting Python keratitis. And of course, Asian countries, the first human infections were reported from Thailand. It was considered to be endemic in Thailand for systemic infections. Now it's gained entry into the eye. So, but the mode of entry is all just like fungal, coastal area, plant matter injury, all of that. Water.
I think we are living in the times of new organisms all over the world.
Yeah.
Sapnesh, anything else? We have any more? I think. So then
there were a few questions, but they have answered.
They were answered. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So I think we will conclude today's webinar here.
Sure.
My many thanks to all the all the 6 presenters, Dr. Savri, Dr. Himalani, Dr. Anand Subramaniam, Dr. Kumar, Dr. Nishita, and Dr. Rashmi. I think each case was unique, had its merits, was very well presented by all of you all, and we had a lot of take-home messages. So thank you to all, and a sincere thank you to our industry partner who helped us organize this webinar, Centis Pharma. Thank you. Ruchi is here from Centis. Thank you so much for the technical backup. Beslin, thank you. Rahul Jain, thank you. And we hope again to collaborate soon. So So with that, Swapnesh, just closing remarks before we say goodbye to everyone.
Thank you, everybody. And I take this opportunity to announce that we would be continuing our PG mock exams from Tuesday, Friday, and they happen from 8 to 9 o'clock. So all the stalwarts over here, you can pass on the messages to your PG students and fellows, whoever are at your institute, to take advantage of it. So thank you, everybody, and a happy Sunday.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.